Welcome to Podsauce, your podcast discovery show. I'm Dax Holt.
I am Alicia Renee.
And we are going to jump right into it. We got Jake Halpern here with us. He is the host of Deep Cover Mobland. It is a fantastic podcast, and we're going to jump into it. Jake, welcome to Podsauce, man.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, for someone who has never heard your podcast, is there a brief description that you can give of what it is, what they can expect from your podcast?
So, my podcast, Deep Cover, is about people that live double lives, often people that go undercover. And the second season of my podcast is a story of a mob lawyer who inexplicably one day flips and decides to start working for the feds undercover.
I want to know if he ever disclosed to you, if he just felt, what was that thing that made him say enough? Because the way he navigated that trial, I don't want to go too much into detail because you guys really should check out the podcast. It was an interesting murder case. And he got the guy off. To me, I was like, you're just like them. Did he never see himself as culpable? Because he knew that the guy did it and he got him off.
Right. Yeah. So that's a great question.
Sorry, I know that was a multi-thing that I just gave you. My apologies.
No. So let me just start by giving like a little bit of context. So this takes place, or the story starts in Chicago in the 70s. And this is like an unimaginably corrupt place.
Right.
Any outcome you desire in the court system, there's typically a way to hire a fixer and get off.
It can be bought.
Whether it's paying a parking ticket, a speeding ticket, DUI, or as in the case you mentioned, a mob hitman is hired to kill someone, kills them, and then Bob is brought in as the fixer in this case. And so what's interesting about this is up until that moment, Bob has been fixing kind of more small potatoes.
Right.
And then he gets this break where this guy, Pat Marcy, who's basically the mob's guy in politics, he's the mob's politician. And he says to him, can you fix this? Can you help us fix this case? And so it's a big deal because it's a murder case. It's high profile. It's a hitman who killed a guy. But it's also an opportunity for Bob, because if he can fix this thing, then he's the man, because it's such a high profile case. So back to your question, right? That's one of the things I asked Bob. I said, Bob, you fixed a murder case. You fixed a case where a hitman killed someone.
And you knew he was guilty. You knew.
Yeah, exactly.
Multiple witnesses that are very, what's the word? They're impeachable.
Yeah. He had two eyewitnesses.
Yes.
So the first thing I thought he might say is, a kind of lawyerly explanation, like, well, we can't be 100% certain he was guilty, or the case, and he like straight up told me, Bob was like, nah, he did it. I knew he did it.
Yeah.
So so that's like, okay, so how do you justify that? And so here's how he justified it. He said it was a mob on mob killing. See, the victim was a Teamster. It's not even really a mobster, but a Teamster. And in Chicago, you have to understand, there was like a mob hit almost every week for a stretch of years. And so there was this whole way of thinking that Bob buys into that I find kind of hard to wrap my head around, which is that if it's a mob killing involving mob business, well, then it doesn't really count as a murder. And I push back about this a lot.
I was about to say, because from my understanding, Jake, the guy in question who was the Teamster, it's not necessarily that he was a bad guy. He wouldn't play ball. He wouldn't bend for the mob, if I understood it correctly, correct?
That was what they thought at the time. That is correct. And then it turns out that wasn't even in the case. He was just, it had been kind of a family squabble where someone in the family had been insulted and the hitman went out and killed him. So it wasn't even a mob hit, really.
Right.
And actually it's interesting because when Bob said that he found that out, that it was a family squabble versus a kind of guy wouldn't bend, he said, I wouldn't have done it if I would have known that. Well, we can debate whether or not that's true.
Thank you.
But, and a lot of the podcast, so Bob's in hiding, basically now. He lives in a place that I can't disclose.
Fair.
But a lot
have we even mentioned that Bob Cooley flipped on the mob? I don't think.
We're getting there. I think that my first thing was I felt like Bob lacked culpability. And my question to Jake was just, did he ever disclose to you that thing that just made him be like, enough? Because like Jake mentioned early in the podcast, he literally went from small town potatoes, fixing tickets, fixing this, fixing that, to such an egregious murder that multiple witnesses, this was a family man, this was in front of his house. Like, you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think the fact that he flipped on the mob obviously is secondary to the fact that I heard no remorse at any point.
There is no remorse. There really isn't any remorse. And I I've been working as a journalist for 25 years. I mean, sometimes you poke around and you feel the kind of elements of remorse. With this, there was times when I was almost cross-examining him because I was probing for that. Like, Bob, you fixed a murder case. And he went on to fix a whole bunch of other cases. And what happens, just to kind of bring us up to kind of where we are with after getting the hitman off, right? He's like the man, because they had 2 eyewitnesses. It was a high-profile case. The press was all over it. And the hitman walks. And this kind of becomes Bob's calling card in a way. Like, if you could get this guy off with 2 eyewitnesses in a high-profile heater case, who couldn't you get off? And for a number of years, he is the mob's man, until one day, kind of out of the blue and inexplicably, he walks into this federal prosecutor's office and basically says to him, "You may or may not know who I am, but I'm the mob's fixer. I know where all the bodies are buried effectively, and I can deliver the mob to you because I know their secrets." And the prosecutor, when I interviewed him, he said to me, "I thought the guy was a nut. I thought he had a messiah complex." But then he has this great second bit where he says, "But who am I to say no to the messiah?" Because it was so good. It was like too good to be true, but it was so good that he had to consider the possibility that Bob was for real. But it made no sense to the point where when the FBI starts vetting him to see if this dude is for real, they're like, is he a mole? Is he like a double agent that the mob has sent in here? Is he dying of cancer? Because they couldn't figure out his motive. And until they could figure out the motive, they couldn't trust him. And so this question that you ask is basically the same question that the FBI and the prosecutors are asking throughout this entire process, because until it's resolved, there's not basically the bedrock of trust you need to launch an operation.
So Jake, you're having this conversation with someone who has been on the run for years and years and years from the mob. He flipped on them, then went into hiding. So Bob Cooley technically doesn't exist anymore, but you're having conversations with this guy. Number one, how did you come in contact with him? And number 2, how do you stay in contact with him? Because he doesn't exist out there publicly. He moves from town to town every couple of years. So how did you make this podcast?
Yeah, well, it was random. I was talking to an FBI agent who had done undercover work in Chicago, and I actually was initially looking into maybe doing the story on him. And he mentioned Bob to me. And I said, "Well, how will I get a hold of this guy?" And he said, "Well, I have his phone number. I can call him. This is this other FBI agent, and see if he'll be willing to talk to you." And so I said, "All right," kind of not thinking it would really pan out. And then he got back to me and said, "Yeah, Bob will talk." And I figured, look, this is a mob lawyer. This is a guy who's survived by his wits. I quite honestly thought this was a guy who was going to ask me, either talk to me for 15 minutes or ask me for a ton of money, neither of which would work for the podcast. And I called him out in this place where he lived, and he talked to me for 3 hours. I think the initial conversation was on Skype, and I recorded it. And I think I just got him at a moment in his life where he really wanted to tell his story, because I remember it was my son's birthday, and I literally had to say, "Bob, we've been talking for 3 hours. Like, my wife's got the birthday cake downstairs. I got to go." But that conversation continued for basically the next year almost, until I finally went out and visited him in person. And that was interesting because that changed my perspective on him in some important ways. But that's how I did it.
Jake, let me ask you, with you speaking to Bob, and obviously Bob knows where the bodies are buried. If I were a part of the mob, I would be under the assumption you too now know where the bodies are buried. Do you ever feel the need to lock your doors extra tight and keep your head on a swivel?
I mean, yeah, my wife asked me that question, when we started, but I kind of think that 2 things. One, I think a lot of the people that Bob turned on are dead at this point, and it happened a while ago. So I took solace in the fact that Bob hasn't basically been killed yet. To think that I mean, obviously I live a more kind of in plain sight life, so I didn't worry about it too much because I thought like it seems like it had cooled off. Also, quite honestly, the mob is not as powerful as they once were. Because the truth is, if the mob were as strong as they once were, even though Bob had flipped 30 years ago, they would still kill him.
Right.
Because
just because of what
on
he
principle,
did. Yeah,
right?
for
Because
sure.
as long as he's walking around talking to me, he's basically thumbing his nose at the mob and saying
1000%.
like, I snitched and I lived, you know, basically. Or I testified, however you want to put it, and lived. So, yeah. I mean, did I look over our shoulder once or twice when I was out there visiting him? Yeah, sure. You know.
Is he nervous at all because he is now letting the mob know, I am still out here, I am alive? I mean, but with this much press and a podcast that has done very well, I got to imagine there's people that are going, dang, he's out there, we need to go get him.
Yeah, I mean, you would think so. I also think that like it speaks to like the way we assess risk as human beings, which is that when we initially are in danger or in a kind of dicey situation, our adrenaline's up. You know, it's like imagine you're on a plane and you hit turbulence. For the first bit, you're like, oh man, it's really bumpy in here. And then an hour later, you're like back to watching Netflix, and that's become your normal, the plane shaking. And I think for Bob, I would say that's played out over 30 years, which is that you can't live on. I don't think you can live on that level of high alert. And so there's a kind of like base level kind of acceptance of maybe the danger that he's in, because he seems oblivious to me, to be honest with you.
Jake, you know, I want to ask about the judge, mainly because you hear stories like Bob's. It's definitely not one of none. Is it one of none? One of none? You know what I mean. Anywho,
I'm like, I don't know that phrase.
Well, it happens. But you have a judge that at one point was just a very honorable judge. He was very scrupulous, and he just devolves, and we listen to him being bought off. But we also hear him have he has more of a moral issue with what he's doing than the guy who's kind of like coaxing him down this road. Whatever happened to that judge? Because I do believe in one of the last episodes I heard, he had a confrontation with Bob, and he was like, "You ruined me." But in my mind, I'm like, "No, you ruined you because you took the money. Let's start there." Yeah, you know. But he did seem to have more of a moral issue than Bob.
Yeah. So it was a hard situation with the judge. This is the judge that presided over the trial that we mentioned earlier on, where there was a hitman who was being tried for murder, and the hitman walked. Bob says, I bribed this judge. And he had some pretty strong corroboration that this had happened. But in the end of the day, I didn't have the judge to talk to, which was difficult. And so I did talk to his daughter in the podcast.
Is the judge dead? Is he no longer with us?
Yes, the judge
by
is
his
dead.
own hand or age or?
I'm not going to tell you.
No.
Because it's actually the climax, and it's in the last episode of the podcast. Yes.
So,
yes.
Jake, hold on after the show. I gotta know. But to me, I feel like the way he was talking, and we'll talk off camera, I felt like he took himself out. I felt like I feel like he removed himself, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and it was the judge's story is a legitimately tragic story, because by all accounts, he was an upstanding and good judge, and we don't know what led him into this relationship that he had with Bob, or what was going on with him at the time. And it's really hard when you're reporting on a story where the man isn't able there to talk to himself. I did talk to his daughter, and you know, she feels that he's innocent. She holds on to the aspects of evidence that she can that indicate that maybe he didn't
the version
take the
of her
bribe.
father that she knows, and that's very fair.
And that was that's the hardest part of the podcast, is what happens to the judge. And Bob cared about this guy. I know that it's odd, because I think at times you can get the sense that Bob is just this completely cold-blooded guy because he was a mob lawyer and this and that. But there's two things I want to say about Bob. Is that I do think that he actually, the judge was a friend of his. And I do think that when the judge ends up dying, that Bob feels responsible. You asked me, does Bob feel remorse for what he's done in his capacity as a mob fixer? And I think the answer is no. But did he feel some level of responsibility for what happened to his friend, the judge? I think the answer is yes. He cared about this guy. And there's a really emotional moment in the last episode of the podcast where Bob, actually to my surprise, really gets emotional about how this all plays out with him. The other thing I would just say about Bob, I do feel I have to put this in here, as kind of frustrating as it was with Bob, when I would say, Bob, do you not feel remorse for the things you've done when you were a fixer? I will say that when he does make the decision to flip, I can't think of many stories that I've reported on my 25 years as a journalist of someone who showed more courage under pressure than Bob did when he wore the wire. And I think that, like, when you're fishing about for who this guy is, there's a lot of critics that Bob has, and they are right to be critical in many ways. But one thing you can't take away from this guy is when he ends up wiring up against the mob, he does it in a way that is it just takes tremendous courage, and he's damn good at it too. And we can get to that.
So, Jake, I want to know, was there a moment where Bob was crazy successful. He was living the high life, rolling tons of money. He was a big deal. He flips, and now he's running around the country, hiding, living in a one bedroom. Is there a moment where he says that he regrets flipping, or in his mind, this is how he would rather be where he's at now than living that double life a long time ago?
Well, that's a great question, and that is like the question that we build to at the end. And you're not going to trick the answer out of me on this one. But I will tell you this: when I was talking to him on Skype, which was for like 9 months, you have to understand this was a crazy like version of like Skype pen pals or something. It was every week or every other week for 3 hours we would talk. And then finally, I was like, I'm going to come out and visit you. And so I flew out to where he's based and got a rental car and drove out to this little house where he is at the edge of the desert. And I saw where he was. And I think that Bob had he's very good at kind of painting and kind of all the kind of high life that he lived and all the excitement, of which there was plenty. But when I saw him face to face, there was a different aspect of him that came out, and we kind of had this last conversation where when he was talking about where his life ended up, it got extremely emotional in a way that very much surprised me, because he never went there before in our other conversations. And it was over this very question about, was it worth it? Everything that you did, and how would you do it differently if you could go back?
And for that answer, make sure you check out Deep Cover
Deep Cover Mobland.
You queued it up for me.
I'm telling you, we're the same person, because I literally was about to say Deep Cover Mobland. Tune in to find out the answer.
So, Jake, obviously I want to push people to listen to your podcast, but is there a podcast that you're listening to that you would push other people to go check out and listen?
That's a good question. Well, I always like to listen to the This American Life feed, because they always have great stories. I also, the last like really great podcast I listened to was Bear Brook. And what they do, it's a true crime podcast, but it's told with great humanity, and also it's odd. So what they do is they find there's an unsolved murder in New Hampshire, and they find there are these two bodies that are in barrels.
Spectacular.
And they basically work backwards to figure out who the victims were and who the killer was. And they do like, okay, here's what I love. I'm not giving you like a short, snappy answer, but I do feel this must be said. With some of these true crime podcasts, you feel that it's just a kind of fetishizing of the crime, and it's just like you lose the human element of it. And what they did that was so powerful in that podcast was without just kind of reveling in the gore and the mystery of it, they also brought to life both the victims, but also the killer. And in fact, you eventually meet one of the killer's relatives. I think it's one of his kids. And it's like such a memorable moment because you can feel this person grappling with the issue of what does it mean to have this person as my father? And maybe other people have tried to do that, but they did it in a way that felt profound to me. Anyway, I don't know how snappy that is, but it's a really good podcast.
No, it sounds
good.
really good.
Yeah, it sounds
we're into
very
it.
good. I'm here for it. Jake Halpern, host of Deep Cover Mobland. Thank you so much.